Up, Watch Doug by Jennifer Arena. Doug bounded over some rocks and scrambled up over a hill and crossed a small stream. The golden retriever was looking for a good spot for camp for the night. Following him were his friends Carl Fredrickson and Russell. Doug met them in South America when Carl and Russell were on an adventure. Doug wanted to find the best camping spot ever just for them. Around his neck, Doug wore a high-tech collar to help him speak to humans. Find a spot! Find a spot! He shouted out loud. Suddenly, Doug found a good place. Point! He shouted, and he froze and pointed toward a clearing up ahead, and the trees on three sides, and a beautiful view across the valley. Russell and Carl looked around. I like it, said Russell. Carl put down a picnic basket that held their dinner and breakfast for the next day. Next to it, he placed a jug of lemonade. Okay, Russell, let's set up these tents of yours, he said. The night had been full of new sights and sounds. Carl, Russell, and Doug had hiked the trail, climbed a beautiful overlook, and now the day was over and the sun was setting. Carl and Russell put up their tents and unrolled their sleeping bags and cooked their dinner over a campfire and afterwards roasted marshmallows. But Russell's yawns were getting bigger. It was bedtime and his eyes were half closed. Russell started to walk towards his tent. Hey, look down there, he suddenly shouted. Carl and Doug went to Russell. On the ground just past the fire was paw prints, and they all stared. Doug sniffed the tracks. What kind of animals made these? Carl asked. A bear, Russell shouted. No, Carl shouted. They're too small. I'll check my Wilderness Explorer's Handbook, said Russell. But Carl shook his head. Bedtime, he insisted. But I will keep watch all night, Doug exclaimed. And I will find out. Do not worry. I will not fall asleep. Good night, Doug, Russell said. And he gave the dog a big hug, and he and Carl went into their tents and zipped up their flaps. Doug was proud to have such an important job, and he was a super watchdog. Doug sat outside in his tent and as still as a statue, and his tail wanted to wag, but Doug wouldn't let it. But wait, what is that by the old oak tree? A squirrel? Doug charged towards the tree and tripped over a rope of Russell's tent, and part of the tent collapsed. Doug hung his head. He didn't mean for that to happen. He waited for Russell to come out, but then he heard a snore. Russell was still sleeping. Doug slunk back to his watching spot, and he had one mistake. He had made one mistake, but that could happen to any watchdog. The moon rose higher and higher in the sky, and Doug wanted to howl at the moon, but that would wake up Carl and Russell, so he buried his nose underneath his paw. Then Doug had an itch on his back, and he rolled over to scratch it, and in that moment a bat swooped down out of the clearing. Doug jumped in surprise and accidentally knocked over the jug of lemonade behind him and spilled it all over the ground. Embarrassed, Doug went to stand guard by Carl's tent again, and it wasn't messy over there. Doug watched as the moon traveled across the sky, and it was really quiet. Rustle, 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 rustle. What was that noise? There, by the picnic basket, rustle, rustle, crack! Doug sneaked across the clearing, keeping low to the ground. He spotted a fresh paw print in the dirt and a shadow near a tree. Something was prowling. Now it was rummaging. Woo, woo, woo! Doug barked. The intruder turned towards him. It had a black mask and a striped tail. It was a raccoon! And it was trying to get the food out of the picnic basket. Not on Doug's watch. Move away from the basket, he said. That is our breakfast and you cannot eat it. The raccoon grabbed a string of sausages in his teeth, and Doug took the other end, and he tugged, and the raccoon tugged, but Doug tugged harder, and the raccoon hissed, and Doug growled, and finally the raccoon let go. Doug had won. Defeated, the raccoon scampered away, and the Doug triumphantly carried the sausages back to the picnic basket. They were a little roughed up and dirty, and a couple leaves stuck out of and some slabbery parts. But he was sure that Carl and Russell wouldn't mind. Doug was proud of himself. He had spotted an intruder in the dark and scared it away. He even saved breakfast, and he felt like a top watchdog. Soon the sky began to lighten, the stars faded, and Doug was sleepy. His eyes were so heavy, and his paws were so heavy, and his ears and his nose felt so heavy too, and he couldn't give up standing guard now. It was almost morning, and Doug put his head down on his paws and rested for a moment, and then he would rest for a moment and then go back to watching. Resting his head felt nice. Maybe he'd rest his eyes for a moment too. It was getting harder and harder to keep them open. Doug closed his eyes and he was gonna go to sleep though, and he was gonna stay up to make sure that Carl and Russell were safe. Nothing was gonna bother him as long as honk shoo. Doug fell asleep, and a few minutes later, Carl came out of his tent. He no longer slept as long as he used to. Carl looked around the clearing and noticed Russell's tent and heard the boy snoring and saw the dirty sausages stinking out of the picnic basket and the jug of lemonade on its side. Carl sat next to Doug, and Doug opened an eye. I found him. I found the creature that made the paw prints, he said. Yes, I heard you, said Carl, and he gave Doug a pat on the head. Good dog. Good Doug. Is it breakfast time yet? Russell suddenly called from inside his tent. No, go back to sleep, Carl replied. After a moment, Russell's snoring continued. Then together, Doug and Carl watched the sun rise over the misty valley.